The United States has really been a leader on atrocity prevention, and Human Rights First has had a particular focus on disrupting the supply chain for mass atrocities. So this is an issue on which we are very engaged. And we're very pleased to have Warren Strobel here to help us navigate this complicated issue. Warren is the diplomatic editor in Reuters' Washington Bureau, where he reports and edits enterprise stories and projects on foreign policy and national security. He has reported from nearly 100 countries, including Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iran. He was previously senior foreign affairs correspondent for McClatchy newspapers. In that capacity, he was part of an award-winning team that consistently questioned the Bush administration's use of intelligence as it made the case for invading Iraq. In retrospect, we know that during the fateful months before the war, McClatchy got it right when nearly every other U.S. media outlet got it wrong. Strobel is also the author of Late-Breaking Foreign Policy, a study of the news media's influence on U.S. foreign policy. We're very pleased to have him with us to guide us in this discussion. Take it away, Warren.
Thank you, Lisa. Can everyone hear me okay? The mic is working. Thank you all for being here. I understand it's been a fabulous summit so far, and we hope to continue that with this luncheon panel. I know it's fashionable at the outset of a panel to say we have the greatest panel ever for you, but I think today we really do. I can't think of three people who are better positioned to address this issue, and I'm going to learn a lot from listening to them speak. Adam Zubin is the director of the Office of Foreign Assets Control at the U.S. Treasury Department, a post he's had, I think, since 2006. That puts him at the lead in the U.S. government's use of sanctions to fight proliferation, terrorism, and the topic we're talking about today, atrocities prevention. This is a subject that has become so sexy that's now the subject of a book by one of Adam's predecessors at Treasury, Juan Zarate, called Treasury's War, which I look forward to reading someday. Daniel Bitkower is a Deputy Assistant Attorney General, the U.S. Justice Department. His brief there includes human rights prosecutions as well as many other important endeavors. He was the winner of an award for helping prosecute the Najibullah Zazi case, which, for those of you who don't know, it was, has been described as the most dangerous attempted attack in the United States since 9/11. And finally, Kathi Lynn Austin is the director and founder of the Conflict Awareness Project. She is probably best known for her 15-year efforts to track down and describe the network of arms trader Victor Aboud, which led to his imprisonment, apprehension imprisonment, excuse me. And she's done many other similar cases as well. So we're looking forward to hearing from them. Very briefly, here's the format. I'm going to ask Adam, Kathi, and David to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes each. Introductory remarks. I'll ask a few questions, and then we're going to open up to the audience. One final note on my participation, I have to add this. Reuters is very old-fashioned in a good sort of way, and I am forbidden from opining on the matters that I cover, so I'm here only as a moderator and to help guide the discussion, but not to give my own opinion. So with that, Kathi Lynn, will you please start us off?
Yeah. Thanks, Bill, for that warm introduction. I really want to applaud Human Rights First for highlighting such a cutting-edge approach to atrocity prevention by hosting this panel. They have been at the forefront of looking at the links between transnational criminal networks and a lot of the mass atrocities and human rights abuses we've seen around the globe. They have funded some of my work, so I'm very proud to be a participant today at the panel. I want to talk briefly about the bad guys. This is what this panel is about. It's the true life villains who populate our world, and they're the ones who are setting up trafficking networks in war zones around the world so that they can enjoy villas in Cape Town and go on shopping sprees in Dubai. And meanwhile, the perpetrators of atrocities that they are facilitating and enabling and sustaining are in places like the Congo, where women are raped on a regular basis by soldiers, and where you see drug trafficking, human trafficking occurring, and even in places such as Syria, in that particular context. So that's who we're talking about today. I think we're aware of the human rights abuses, we're aware of the atrocities, so I really want to focus today on what these networks are about. There are certain elements that are in common amongst these networks. These networks and these organizations are specifically set up to facilitate war and conflict. And they have a market advantage in doing so. And it's the high yield profits, whether they're involved as well in gold trafficking or natural resource exploitation or wildlife trafficking in the areas where they're bringing in weapons. They are sustaining these networks at a great advantage. They're always using front companies and offshore islands to carry out their activities, and they're using flags of convenience, ships and planes that are registered in kind of out-of-the-way places. Over and above the gravity of the aiding and abetting of the war crimes that they're participating in, as I mentioned, they're also involved in all kinds of other illicit financial crimes, money laundering, fraud. All of these kinds of crimes can also be prosecuted and can be a tool to tackle these kinds of criminal networks. But I think perhaps most worrying to us today and why we're sitting in this room is because they often are trying to use the cover of US entities. They're trying to acquire American aircraft. Their financial transactions are often using US banking systems and using the American dollar. So it can make the US government and it can make US entities seemingly complicit in some of these war crimes. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're here today to discuss this. Hopefully the two cases I'll discuss will illuminate some of these issues. And then I'd like to conclude just a few remarks on why I think the President Obama's strategy for executive order that was passed in 2011 on transnational criminal organizations provides us with a fundamentally powerful and new tool to tackle some of these networks that are behind some of the atrocities that are occurring. The first investigation I'd like to share with you is an investigation that looked at the regrouping of some of Victor Boot's networks. And I think you all may be somewhat familiar with sort of this Nick Cage character, the Lord of War, Victor Boot. But he was convicted by the US government on 5 counts of terrorism, but that did not stop his networks from wanting to continue to operate. And they had to find a new way to regroup and to fit in. And so basically they went to an offshore island, Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, which is a gateway to some of the Middle Eastern conflicts and African conflicts that they wanted to supply, and set up shop. These kinds of criminal networks like to use offshore havens to avoid taxes, where Dropbox addresses become part of their routine. And so that is, again, one of the reasons why confronting these kinds of networks using law enforcement tools is a good way to try to tackle what their activities are. In the case of Victor Boot's former networks, one of the lead entities was a man, a Russian colleague known by the name of Sergei Denisenko. He is on a US sanctions list, and yet he was able to sign contracts to lease aircraft from the US that he was hoping to utilize in some of these war zones, including Congo, Sudan, and Syria. It's really important to note that a country as under-resourced as Mauritius actually took action against these actors. They stopped the network from using their territory. They launched a money laundering investigation, and they've tightened up aviation and money laundering controls in order to avoid these kinds of networks from operating on their shores. The 2 Russian sort of headmasters behind this arms trafficking network moved back to Moscow, where they now have protection. But because of the exposure of their activities, aviation companies in places like Kyrgyzstan have stopped contracts that they were previously had with these networks. So it illuminates the fact that just a little bit of exposure can help bring and stop and stem the activities of these particular networks. Had Victor Boot's network, however, been put on a transnational criminal organization designation list, we would have had the tools to go after this before their activities occurred. These kinds of tools help us with a number of factors. They can help us reduce the recidivism that occurs with these kinds of groups operating from conflict zone to conflict zone again and again. It can cut down on the ability of sanctions violators like Denisenko from using family members' names and bank accounts and setting up new companies that are not on a sanctions identifier list in order to carry out their activity. Putting an entity like this on a transnational criminal organization designation list can also expand the notices and alerts that go out from the US so that other countries like Mauritius will know in advance what to watch out for. And it can also activate and trigger law enforcement cooperation agreements before these kinds of activities take place. There is also the concern when sanctions are lifted on a country, like which may happen with Liberia in short notice, these particular entities therefore can stay on a list. The second investigation I want to highlight very briefly is a gold trafficking case out of the Congo. This involved corporate actors that were based out of Jersey Channel Island, another offshore haven, and involved a precious metal trader in the UK. This particular network was, over a long period of time, was able to take out gold out of the Congo through an illicit pipeline for many years without any kind of law enforcement monitoring, criminalization of their activity. This one particular pipeline I discovered back in 2004 when I was working for the United Nations as an arms trafficking expert, monitoring the sanctions regime on the Congo. And it kind of highlights one of the sort of weaknesses of the sanctions regime, that even though these particular entities were put on notice at the time and were discovered, all they got was a slap on the wrist, and they continued to traffic gold out of the Congo. And as a result, you didn't get a high bar set to deter this kind of activity by other players in the field. So one of the things that I have found is kind of really important is when we want to tackle these particular criminal networks, there's a number of things that I think can sort of help stymie and disrupt these networks. And that is creating high-level bars for punishment and fines. We need to be sure that there is effective deterrence in place. We can also pursue these entities for different kinds of crimes, money laundering, financial crimes, as I mentioned. In the case of this gold conflict enterprise that I just mentioned, we now have European prosecutors that have opened up cases against some of the key culprits. And they've opened up a war crimes case, which is the first time the war crimes platform of pillage, which is just basically theft in the context of an international conflict, has been used since the post-World War II era. So it illuminates that if we pursue these entities as criminal networks and look at their activities not just as sanctions violators and not just as kind of the bad guys out there, that we can actually stop their particular activities. Finally, just to conclude, I want to say that one of the reasons why, and I hope we can open this up for discussion today, that I think it's important to tackle these middlemen and these enablers. These are the pipelines and the supply chains that are actually fueling the conflicts that we're most concerned about today, is that if we begin to pull apart these facilitators, we highlight them, we tackle their architecture and their ecosystem, we can actually begin to disincentivize war in certain places. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's very important to begin to go after these criminal networks. And the Obama administration has provided us with two brilliant strategies which, if wedded together, could really help us get a grasp on these particular networks. That is the atrocity prevention strategy and the transnational criminal organization strategy. Together, if they are linked, they can provide a powerful tool. And the way that they can do it is in four specific arenas. That is, it would have the advantage of going after these networks across conflicts so that you don't just have to have a country-specific targeting regime to go after them. It would likely reduce the recidivism that I've been, which I can hardly pronounce, that I've been talking about. The repeat offenders that, do we have to wake up and see another Enough Project report or another Human Rights First report on the gold trafficking networks out of the Congo. This has been going on for over a decade. Elevating the status of a network, putting it on a TCO designation list, for example, will trigger better multinational alerts, cooperation, so you don't always have to catch the criminal networks red-handed. And finally, I think the most important for us here in the audience as American citizens is that elevating the status of these networks will help send out a better signal to U.S. corporations and U.S. sectors such as the aviation sector. It will alert them to these kinds of problems so that the U.S. itself is not seen as complicit in some of the worst crimes that are being committed around the world today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathi. That was a great start. I was struck by what you said about Mauritius. I mean, here's a country I don't know a lot about, but I assume it has very few governmental resources. It's remote. It has other problems to worry about, yet in the instant you cite, they actually took action, so that's optimistic. Adam, can you talk a little about what Treasury's doing? What are the possibilities of sanctions and other financial tools, and what are the limitations?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And first I want to thank Alyssa and Tad for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here and in many ways humbled. This is not the usual group that I address, and I have such admiration for the work that not just Human Rights First does, but that many of you in this room do, whether you're studying atrocities, reporting on it, or actively going out and trying to alleviate the causes and impacts of these horrible acts. I mean, you all are doing the most courageous work and most important work there is. And by comparison, I'm a bureaucrat. That was brought home to me when I opened up the program and saw the photo for Kathy's biography, which is Kathi standing on a hilltop in a flak jacket, staring off into the sun with her face windburned. And you can see that there's just danger all around. And then you flip to mine, and I'm in a little room with an American flag behind me, braving possible paper cuts, or maybe the flash would have been a little bit much for me. There are dangers in my job too, I want you all to know. So it is humbling, as I said, and we're so grateful for the work that you all are doing, and we're actually avid consumers of it. As I'll get to in a moment, sanctions are fueled by information. Like almost everything the government does, effective sanctions depend on detailed, reliable, credible information. And in this sphere in particular, probably more so than any other sphere in which we use our sanctions, we get some of the most useful information from folks in NGOs, in the media, expert teams. Like you mentioned, you had served on an expert team in the UN. They do phenomenal work, and we're often relying on them to be the eyes and ears that allows us to take sanctions action. So I want to thank you all for that as well. The use of targeted sanctions in the human rights world is not new. We've been doing it in one form or another for over a decade. I've been at Treasury for 9 years and have been engaged in these efforts from the beginning. And I have to say, they're among the most meaningful and rewarding aspects of my job. We were active very early on in 2006 in the efforts on Sudan and Darfur to try to use sanctions in a more impactful way to affect the government and to disrupt what the government of Sudan at the time was doing. I say in a more effective way because we had at the time comprehensive sanctions on Sudan that dated back to the period of the Civil War. And there was a perception that we were sanctioned out, that we had hit the ceiling in terms of what we could do to Sudan. After all, no imports were allowed, no exports were allowed, no investment was allowed by US persons or US banks. But that didn't turn out to be the case. And with the help of some very creative and insightful people within the government, and I think people at Treasury really deserve a lot of credit for this as well, they identified key pressure points that were subject to more impactful sanctions than the broad embargo. And what I mean by that are parastatals, for example. that were state-owned entities that the government of Sudan was and is operating, that were interacting on a daily basis and dependent on their access to international banks, to international insurance companies, international shipping companies. And so while US firms had been cut off from Sudan for some time, foreign firms viewed the US embargo as precisely that, a US embargo. And it had very little deterrent impact on them. When we came out and started naming companies, particularly when, and I want to emphasize this, particularly when we were able to link those companies to atrocities, as we were able to do, for example, with an air cargo firm that we were able to show was ferrying armaments for use in Darfur, another firm that was supplying militarized vehicles, again, for use in conflict zones. What you saw was other countries and other private sector actors taking note, non-American companies distancing themselves from these firms and cutting them off, making them pariahs. So it allowed us to, ironically, by taking a much narrower focus, by doing something that looked on paper much softer. Right? We went from having a total transactional ban on the country of Sudan to focusing on individual firms, banks, and car companies. We were able to magnify the impact because we made those impacts extraterritorial, multilateral, however you want to describe it. And that, I think, served as a precedent for us to build on as we went forward. We've been very active in recent years with respect to human rights situations in DRC, which Kathi referenced, in Zimbabwe, Burma, Syria, and Iran, and you've seen dozens and dozens of announcements of targets, senior government officials, state-owned entities, front companies, offshore accounts, money movers, in all of those situations to try to disrupt their work, make it more difficult for them to operate, make it more difficult for them to fund their horrible acts. So we, and OFAC in particular, are huge backers and huge believers in the importance of the sanctions tool. I think it's a key complement to what is necessarily going to be a government-wide and an all-government-wide effort, because we can't rely on any tool by itself. And, but sanctions absolutely have to be a part of that, and they have to be an active part of that. In terms of the constraints that we face, though, I think they're real here, and I do want to point out a few of them and maybe come back to some more in the question and answer period, because they're not always so obvious from the outside. The first, and probably the first question I ask when someone comes into my office and says, we're confronting a human rights situation, can we use sanctions effectively? I say state actor or non-state actor. And it's a black and white difference in terms of what we can offer, what the tool of sanctions can offer. If you're talking about the government of Sudan engineering massacres of its citizens, if you're talking about the government of Burma cracking down, the government of Syria, the government of Iran, you're talking about a very fat target in many ways that is necessarily dependent on hundreds, if not thousands, of commercial relationships across everything it's doing. And what that allows us to do is say, okay, we're going to name, blacklist, some people call it name and shame, the people who are involved in these standard list prosecutions, the people who are detaining citizens without cause. Those sanctions, as you can imagine, have some symbolic impact, not a tremendous material impact in terms of reversing those people's activities. But simultaneously, we're going to focus on the pressure points of these regimes. And at that point, sort of the sky's the limit in terms of what we can hit. We can look at what are their key revenue sources, where are their investments, where do they hold their banks, what are the currencies that they're using to trade in and to store their foreign reserves. All of that is fair game because what we're trying to do is influence their foreign policy or their domestic policy, and any pressure point is a good pressure point. I think Sudan is a good example of that. We did name bad human rights violators and atrocity committers. I do not think those actions were anywhere close to the most impactful sanctions we levied on Sudan. I think the most impactful sanctions that we heard constant complaints about indirectly and directly from the government of Sudan were sanctions on their joint petroleum ventures, their sugar companies, all the major sources of revenue for the government. Because having an Air Force commander added to a sanctions list, perhaps he was disturbed by it, perhaps not, but it didn't change the fate of what was happening on the ground. So when you're talking about a state actor, we have a real spectrum of tools to draw on. When you're talking about a non-state actor, and you can think of the conies of the world, you're looking at a much narrower band in terms of pressure points. And likewise, when you talk about enablers of atrocities, and I think it's really commendable that Human Rights First, Kathi and her work have been focused on those, because that's how we think. You know, what are the support columns that these bad actors are relying on? Sometimes those support columns are opaque, very hard to track, and sometimes they're actually pretty thin and feeble. Some of these groups are self-supporting. They support themselves through crime on the ground, robbery, stealing from sometimes aid groups, stealing from the citizens in the areas they police, taxation in kind of a mafia-like style of operations. And their costs are not certainly as extravagant as we would find if we were looking at an organized crime network like the Japanese Yakuza, or a sophisticated narcotics network like the Sinaloa cartel. The costs of a coney network are sadly not that high. And when you combine those elements of often self-supporting groups who are not profit-oriented, right? They're not out doing what they're doing to make money, unlike the narcotics cartels, unlike the organized crime groups, unlike these sophisticated arms traffickers, you end up, very unfortunately, with a narrower band of operation, narrower operating space. The final complicating factor that I wanted to flag here is information. I talked on the positive side about how reliant we've been and how useful the reporting we've seen from NGOs, from human rights groups, from UN expert teams have been. But I would say we are more frustrated by informational gaps in this area than in any other sanctions area that we work on. It's just notoriously hard. And part of what's, I think, so great about the president's strategy that Kathi talked about is that it is whole of government, that you have an atrocity prevention board coming together frequently that involves the intelligence community and law enforcement and USAID and all of our colleagues. And so we can say, okay, we're confronting a very worrisome situation in South Sudan. What do we know and what do we need to know? How can we address those collection gaps? It is not going to be the top collection priority for the CIA in 2013 to go around the world and find incipient atrocity situations and collect on them. It's going to be a priority, an important priority, but it won't be, and it can't be their top priority. And so those gaps that we face are very real and are fatal at times to our work. We don't put a name on the list, and we can't put a name on the list unless we have solid, credible information as to who they are and what they've done, and a way of identifying them in a unique way, a date of birth or passport number, something that will allow banks, customs authorities to know, is this the Adam Zubin I'm trying to stop, or is this another Adam Zubin? And so those things which sound mundane, like technocrat-type concerns, can actually be showstoppers if we don't have the information we need. So I don't want to be the wet blanket, although I think that is my job on today's panel.
Need one?
And I do want to reinforce how committed we are to using this tool creatively, aggressively, in every way possible, because there's nothing more important that we work on than these atrocity situations. But I do want to also sort of bring you into the tent in terms of many of the challenges that we face in our day-to-day work. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. That was great. I was really interested in what you said about the difference between states and state-run enterprises and the parastatals. I've written a lot personally about the Iran sanctions, which not apropos to today's discussion, but I think most people would agree while the targeted sanctions on different enterprises and individuals had an impact, it was the oil sanctions that brought Iran to the table.
And financial, I would say.
And financial, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a distinction we can discuss maybe in another context. I'm incredibly grateful to have David Bitkower here. David scrambled his schedule, I'm assuming, to join us after another speaker dropped out, and it's essential that we get the Justice Department views on these issues. So David, please go ahead, and if there's any particular cases that you've been involved in recently that you feel comfortable about sharing with us, that would be most interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren, and also I'd echo Adam and Kathy's comments. Thank you to the folks at Human Rights First, Lisa and Tad, for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to speak on this topic. And also to echo something Adam said, and something hopefully we can come back to at the end, is there is a very valuable role that the NGO and the human rights community can play in helping us do our job, which is to use criminal prosecution when we go after perpetrators and enablers of atrocities. So I'll say again, and not to over-echo what Kathi started with, but this is a timely moment for this conversation. The government has recently put forth 2 new strategies. The Atrocities Prevention Board was stood up in 2012, just last year, designed to address atrocities around the world and to identify any gaps or tools that we need to prevent and seek accountability for those atrocities, as well as for those who enable them. As part of the Atrocities Prevention Board, the Department of Justice has been playing a role in trying to identify gaps and areas where we can contribute to the prevention of atrocities. Primarily, of course, as the Department of Justice, the tool that we bring to the table is criminal prosecution. And criminal prosecution plays many roles across contexts, primarily accountability, but also prevention and deterrence. And those are very valuable tools in the atrocities context as in the traditional criminal context. So that keys into something Kathi mentioned as well, which is in 2011, just a year before the launching of the Atrocities Prevention Board, the government put forth a new government-wide strategy on the prevention of transnational organized crime. And those 2 strategies can work together because they both take a similar whole-of-government approach or an all-tools approach to addressing threats to U.S. national security and moral responsibilities of the United States as well. Within the department, we've also taken steps to reflect those same priorities. Just 3 years ago, a little more than 3 years ago, the department created the Human Rights and Special Prosecution section within the Criminal Division, which is a section that is devoted toward the prosecution and investigation of violators of human rights and other international criminals. And so that's been a major step forward for the department, and in just over 3 years, including the work of predecessor sections before that as well, the department has brought significant prosecutions involving human rights, and we hope to keep doing so. We've seen that same emphasis reflected from our law enforcement partners as well, and we have recently the FBI standing up a war crimes and genocide unit, and we've had great partnership from the Department of Homeland Security through the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement section, which has a human rights and war crimes section as well. And their human rights program actually just celebrated its 10th anniversary earlier this week. So that they've been a great partner as well. And obviously, it goes without saying, Treasury and other departments we've worked closely with to address these same issues. And then as part of that increasing emphasis and gathering of tools, we have new statutory tools that have become available in the last decade or so. New statutes to make it a substantive crime to commit genocide, war crimes, torture, the use of child soldiers. And these are tools that we're hopeful that we can use more and more as the time goes on, obviously, to redress and prevent atrocities, but the more we can use them to do so, the better that will be. So those changes overall, I think, reflect what both Adam and Kathi mentioned, which is this goal of using whatever tool we have in the toolbox that's available to achieve our priorities. And they reflect in many ways 2 different kinds of ways of looking at crime. Traditionally, one thinks of looking at crime as you have a crime, a bank robbery or a theft or a murder, and you try to identify who did it. But there's another way of looking at crime that we've seen more and more often, which is you identified a threat actor up front. You know who is committing the atrocity. You know who is committing terrorism, for example. And you need to identify the methods and means of redressing that and bringing them to justice and preventing further crimes or further atrocities. So this is a new approach in some senses, but in some senses it's an ages-old approach by the department. You know, since the Treasury Department was instrumental in prosecuting Al Capone for tax evasion, we've done things like this, which is say, we have a problem, we need to stop it. What tools do we have at our disposal to do so? So I'd like to highlight some of the successes we've had actually in recent years in doing that. We've used the torture statute substantively for the prosecution and conviction of Chucky Taylor, for torture committed in Liberia in 2008. And that's something that actually also displays the partnership that we've had with NGOs who were helpful in that case in identifying witnesses and increasing our chances of bringing him to justice, which is another example of the sort of all tools approach. We've also had numerous prosecutions of human rights violators from the Balkan Wars or from Rwanda, sometimes on the substantive charges, but also frequently when they've tried to seek safe haven in the United States, we often seek to prosecute them for immigration-related offenses where they've lied about their involvement in past crimes or past atrocities. And we can use that to convict them criminally, to get them sentenced, often to get a sentence that reflects not just the immigration crime, but the underlying activity that informs who they are as a person as well. And then at the end of the day, to have them removed from the United States so that they can't seek safe haven here. We also can use many of these same tools against enablers, right? So just because a statute is designed for a substantive human rights violation doesn't mean we can't use it to prosecute or investigate someone who is enabling human rights violations. And it's a long-standing principle in federal criminal law, as well as criminal law across the board, that those who aid and abet crimes are to be punished as if they've committed them. And those who conspire can also be prosecuted. So even without a specific statute or tool aimed at enablers per se, we can use many of the same tools that we already have that criminalize substantive human rights violations or other crimes against enablers. Then to key off also something Adam said, right? We talked about, Adam talked about the use of sanctions as one of the tools of disrupting networks and facilitators. One of the benefits of sanctioning in the OFAC Treasury process for the Department of Justice is it can become a crime, a federal crime, to aid someone who has been designated either a country, a sanctioned country, or an entity. And we can use a statute that has been used most frequently in the sanctioned country context, but it can also be used in these other contexts, to criminally prosecute somebody who willfully aids a sanctioned entity. And so that's the kind of thing that you can see also as a door that is opened as we use more of these tools. There are challenges associated with it, as Adam mentioned, and we can talk about some of those a little more later, but it definitely does add a tool to the toolbox, and you have seen charges for folks who are charged with aiding and abetting or supporting sanctioned entities under these Treasury regimes. We've seen, obviously, Kathi mentioned the Victor Boot example. Obviously, Victor Boot is another good example of a case that although the weapons he was using, of course, were going to war zones and conflict zones, the crime of prosecution was something different. The crime of prosecution was based on terrorism statutes, based on incidents that occurred separately from the arms trafficking over the years past and the decades past. And that's an example of a case where he's now serving 25 years in jail, but based on terrorism statutes and weapons statutes, and not based on, say, human rights statutes or necessarily even statutes that reflect his historical activities. We've used that same sort of type of statute to prosecute people who have, for example, earlier this year, I supervised not only the human rights section, but also the organized crime and gang section of the department. And just this past year on the organized crime side, we had a conviction of some Philippine nationals who were trying to illegally import weapons and then transship them to the Mexican drug cartels. And so you see that same sort of all tools approach and thinking creatively about how do we address these problems proactively using whatever we have at hand and whatever the sort of best tools are for that. So those are good success stories. There are obviously challenges as well. Just because when you shift the focus from the completed crime to how do you deal with a particular threat actor or threat, you have a situation where it may seem obvious or even flagrant that someone is breaking the law and deserves to be prosecuted. But that's a very different thing from saying we have enough evidence that we can bring before an American court or American jury to convict them based on the procedural protections and the substantive law we have here. So there can be a gap between what you read in the paper and what you can do and prove criminally. There can be, in these cases, some of the key challenges we face are, generally speaking, the perpetrators are abroad. Generally speaking, the evidence that we would need to convict them may be abroad. Sometimes we have the fortune of using financial or other records that are located here, but the witnesses to what they've done and the folks who've seen on the ground why this is an important case, why we're talking about atrocities, are generally located abroad. In the context of mass atrocities, as you can imagine, one of the greatest challenges is finding witnesses who are willing to testify in public about what they've seen and what they've witnessed. We had a great conviction just last month of Jorge Sosa, who was involved in the Guatemalan Dos Aires massacre in 1982, where they effectively massacred a village of 250 people. And he then later became an American citizen, obviously without revealing his role in that atrocity. And we were able to convict him just in October of those immigration crimes. But to prove the lie, you also have to prove that there was an underlying crime. And that can be a challenge, as you can imagine, to find people who can testify about grievous actions that were taken in 1982 in a foreign country by people they may be fearful of. And those are challenges which we count on, obviously, the law enforcement agents and the dedication of the prosecutors to work through, as well as, obviously, the role of the NGO community in bringing some of those to our attention. But as you can imagine, it can be painfully obvious to everyone that a massacre occurred, and it can be obvious to everyone what group or entity was responsible for it. But to actually pin criminal responsibility on an individual requires months or even years or even more of work to establish to the satisfaction of a court. But that said, with the approach that we're taking, right, the sort of all tools approach, we do hope to have more success in the future. I think you're going to see more of this sort of creative thinking, not just the Department of Justice, obviously, but working with all of its partners across the government. So working with the Treasury when it comes to sanctioned entities and perhaps charging people for aiding them. But even within the department, so the human rights section uses tools that are not necessarily traditional human rights tools and are always constantly, every day, talking to the folks in the national security section, or constantly talking to the folks in the organized crime section, or talking to the financial folks, the asset forfeiture section, to think of ways that we can identify perpetrators and hold them accountable one way or the other. And so I don't want to take up too much time repeating what's been said before, because it's all true and I agree with all of it. But I do want to say at the end, to close this, there is no question that the folks in this room can be helpful in bringing that to our attention. And one of the real initiatives that the department has taken and the human rights section has taken in the last few years is to reach out to the NGO community and reach out to the human rights community and say, if you have leads, if you know of folks in the United States who can testify to atrocities abroad, if you know of folks abroad who can report on who the wrongdoers are and who you think we should be targeting, our door is always open to have those conversations, and those can be very helpful toward identifying who we want to target, how we want to target them, and identifying evidence that we can actually use to charge and convict them. And so some of the folks in that section are sitting over here in the back. Also, they have pamphlets they can hand out as well. And that's, if we can just engage in one or two of those conversations after this panel, I think we'll have had some success in achieving in moving the ball forward. But I think that's the takeaway, I think, from our perspective, is the more we can talk, the more we can be creative, the more we can work together on these problems, the more success we will have, even despite some of the challenges that we're going to face no matter what.
Thank you very much, David. Great. Having written a little bit about these issues, I know that the whole of government approach that you described is probably the only one that's going to work, because the topic, the organizations, the problem is itself so complex that you need to kind of go after it from the different tools in the U.S. government toolbox. There's a couple of things I neglected to say in my brief introduction. Before I got here, I was furiously Googling everybody, doing my homework. And Kathleen, is it true that Angelina Jolie is going to play you in a movie next year, or a movie based on your life story? Because I think that's
yeah.
true. Those.
No, I think by the time the movie is ever made, she'll be way past, we'll all be sort of long gone from here. But yeah, there's been a lot of interest in that particular story.
That's great. The other thing I wanted to mention, on a much more sober subject, there is even today, what a UN official has called a pre-genocidal situation in the Central African Republic. As Reuters and others just reported, there was a UN resolution this morning to send peacekeepers there. And that might be something that we want to discuss in the Q&A or in the discussion up here. Being a journalist, I have a zillion questions, but I'm going to limit myself to one, real quick one, because we need to get the audience involved. And that question is, the Atrocities Prevention Board, the President's executive order of, I guess, late 2011, has that made a difference? Are there specific instances you can point to? Kathi, you want to start off, and maybe our representatives from the U.S. government can weigh in briefly, and then let's get to the audience.
Well, I think part of us from the human rights community would love to hear from our government representatives. We're not that familiar with the internal workings of the Atrocity Prevention Board, since it is such a high-level board, and they're constantly trying to make decisions as to what they should be focused on and targeting. But we have seen some very specific initiatives come out of the Atrocity Prevention Board. We're aware of certain targeting initiatives that have come about. I think one of the main concerns I've had, and I haven't been in DC in recent months, but on my previous visit here, one of the things I kept hearing was that Syria was not really being taken up as much by the Atrocity Prevention Board, since it was sort of full-blown and underway. And so I think for me, one of the things I would like to see is sort of more attention as well to this conflict is going to tick on for some time. What can the U.S. government be doing to prevent future atrocities, even when a particular war zone has blown up? But again, just sort of to bring it back to what I was trying to preface in my brief remarks, is that I think the Atrocity Prevention Board has a unique opportunity to wed the transnational criminal organization strategy and to kind of work that into its proceedings. And we know that there are perhaps some entities who are focused both from the U.S. government who are focused both on the atrocities prevention policies, but also the transnational criminal organizations. I'm amazed at the portfolio that our government colleague has, where he's looking at human rights, gangs, and other kinds of entities. But again, that holistic approach, which I think the Atrocity Prevention Board can bring, should include the sort of criminalization of the activities of these enablers, because Adam is sort of really highlighted how they provide us with very specific targets to go after: insurance companies, shipping companies, airlines, banks. They are the kinds of sectors that the U.S. government has some reach over.
Adam or David, any quick thoughts?
I mean, I've been privileged to sit on the Atrocity Prevention Board since it was stood up, and to me it's made a tremendous difference. I do appreciate that difference isn't viewed as clearly, I think, from the outside, and the APB is aware of that and is taken upon itself more communication, more engagement to show people what we're doing and what impact it's having. But I can tell you, sitting at the table, it's night and day. The response to atrocity situations, if you go back 4 years, 6 years, 10 years, in my experience in the government, was stovepiped, it was ad hoc, and it was sluggish. And by sluggish, I mean not that people didn't care about these things, but that until you could sort of rouse the beast and get all of these different agencies around a table focused on something at a high enough level to make a difference, the atrocities had to be pretty far along and pretty serious. And I think one of the insights behind the setting up of this board is we can sometimes actually do a whole lot more, just like you hear about in the health sector. Prevention can be cheaper and more effective than dealing with it after it's a full-blown disease and coming in and trying to cure. And I think the same is true with some of these situations. So what I see happening on the APB that wasn't happening, frankly, beforehand is we're getting together every month, and sometimes more frequently. We're having our colleagues from the USAID, State Departments, the intelligence community, briefing on across the world where they see situations that are worrisome, that are more than worrisome, that seem to had been situations that had been at an even boil that now seem to be boiling up, and vice versa. And then everyone is there, and people tend to be mid to high level, but high level enough that they can speak for their agencies, and they can commit resources and commit, at the very least, to alert the most senior people in their agencies to these situations. And I have seen specific instances. One I would point to would be disturbing events that were unfolding in South Sudan not that long ago, where I think the early identification of the problem, the early intervention, was key. And I personally think the situation could have gotten much, much worse had our government and others, I'm not viewing this through a US-only prism, but in our government, that activity was centered in the APB. And the same has been true with ethnic violence in Burma against the Muslim population there, and in any number of other instances. So it's, to my mind, a huge advance. I think that a lot of those impacts that I'm talking about are often happening below the waterline. Right? If we're going out and approaching a foreign government official with a pretty sober and alarming message, that's not a Treasury designation, it's not an indictment, and so it doesn't get a press release, but it may be more effective than any of those.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add one other positive example that I would offer. That is something the Department of Justice does besides just prosecute. Also, is in conjunction with the State Department, conduct training and capacity building exercises abroad. So, if through the lens of the Atrocities Prevention Board, we can identify countries that are at risk of destabilizing events or future atrocities, one thing we can do is dedicate resources in that direction in a way that hopefully builds up protections against atrocities happening in the first place through training, the rule of law, and the other protections that we can take.
It's time to go to the audience. I'm sure we have lots of questions, and I'm sorry we probably have not left us enough time. Way in the back here.
Thank you very much. I think it's been an excellent presentation, very enlightening for someone who is not American. But just a question to Adam, even maybe for David as well. On countries where we've had very teething problems, looking at maybe Libya, Egypt, Syria. I was just curious whether you would be able to share with us the operational difficulties that you encounter in terms of implementation of this good strategy that you have of disrupting, these economic and commercial interests in order to contribute towards the reduction of violations. So just some insights on why it becomes difficult. And then I come from Zimbabwe myself. We have some violations that took place in extractive industries, especially where you have strategic minerals, assets, diamonds, gold. And we have had a situation where the European Union have now uplifted sanctions as it relates to the trade in diamonds. And I'm not too sure how your operations as OFAC would work in a situation where your partners in the Western world are going to be allowing for trade in an area where you may be wanting to implement disruptive activities. Thank you.
Sure. Let me try to take those in turn. The impact and success of sanctions ends up being very case-specific. And by that I mean both what we know about the situation, the intelligence that's feeding our work, but also the characteristics of the target. And you brought up Libya, Egypt, Syria. There's probably no better example of three countries to show you the spectrum of that. I'll just point to Libya and Syria on either end. In the case of Libya, when we saw Gaddafi's forces at the gates of Benghazi and there was worldwide alarm, we deployed, redeployed a sanctions regime against the Gaddafi government because we had sanctions against Gaddafi before 2004. And we were actually beneficiaries of that because my office is blessed by many old-timers, and 5 of the people sitting around the table with me said, oh, I have a list in my office of all the major banks in Libya and their ownership stakes in foreign banks because we just did this 6 years ago. We pulled that together almost literally over a weekend, and 7 days later, we were sitting on $37 billion of frozen Gaddafi regime assets. I'm not aware. I mean, we've had a lot of success in a number of areas, and I think what's playing out now in Geneva with respect to Iran is a huge testament to years of work, but I've never witnessed $37 billion frozen over 7 days. That was as easy as it gets when it comes to sanctions, and for some reason, the Gaddafi government had decided to keep all of its assets in Western European and US banks, thankfully. We don't get that lucky very often. And at the other end of the spectrum, when you look at Bashar Assad, much, much harder target from a sanctions perspective in terms of where their assets are held, what their financial revenues are, lifelines, where their foreign reserves are being traded. So while we've applied sanctions, heavy sanctions, executive order after executive order, targeting senior Syrian officials, those involved in atrocities, those involved in supplying the tools of suppression to Syria, and on, I would have to candidly admit, have had much less impact than we would like using the sanctions tool in Syria. And that doesn't mean we're not going to keep at it, and we're not going to, we will, but it's been much harder going. And so you can see the very mundane things that affect our ability to do what we do successfully. When it comes to Zimbabwe, we still have maintained our sanctions that target the specially designated nationals, that include a number of firms in the extractive fields that you're talking about. And so long as those sanctions remain in place, though the law will forbid money moving through the US, and that is not just governing US companies purchasing diamonds or gold from parties that are on our list, but it prohibits any of those companies from accessing the US financial system, even for dollar clearing, which means offshore to offshore transactions are very frequently impeded, disrupted, or frozen because of these sanctions. So we do, because of our prominence in the international financial system, our sanctions speak more loudly than perhaps other autonomous unilateral sanctions. That's a good thing if you're a believer in our foreign policy, and I think in this case it's doing quite a bit of good.
Another question from the side of the room?
Ignacio Mujica from Human Rights First. My question would be to Mr. Adam. There are other sanctions regimes that seem to be suitable for disabling enablers as well in other conflict situations. For instance, the Somalia sanctions regime for charcoal trade, thinking of Al-Shabaab, for instance, or the Syria sanctions evaders for possibly people shipping in weapons to the conflict area. However, some of those regimes have received very few designations. Is that because of this gap of information, or is the office prioritizing its resources and focusing on other topics such as Iran, for instance?
You know, again, enablers, I think, while an incredibly important focus, is a very broad term. And you gave two specific instances. Somebody who's shipping or selling and shipping weapons to Syria is an enabler. It's a very targeted type of enabling that lends itself to our tool if it can be identified. You talked about the sale of Somali charcoal. That's hundreds of small sellers in skiffs going between Somalia and largely Gulf countries, doing trade that is lucrative, but we're not talking about the Zimbabwe diamond trade. But we viewed it as contributing, and the UN identified it as contributing to Al-Shabaab's revenues. The first is a targeted situation. The second is a phenomenon. And we've used our tools against both. To do the first, you need the intelligence. You need to know who is the merchant, where's the ship, and we need to have more than just allegations and hearsay to be able to act. To do the second, obviously we need to have a firm basis, but you have broader latitude because you can rely on a whole collection of reporting to say, okay, this looks like a trend. And we've done that not just with Somali charcoal, we've done it with timber, jadeite, rubies coming out of Burma, Zimbabwean conflict diamonds, conflict minerals. You've seen it with the crude oil sales out of Syria and Iran. Pretty much anywhere where we can find those heavy revenue intensive trade lines, we can pressure them.
Yeah, I just add to that. Adam's right. You can't just, it's very difficult to collect a lot of intelligence on a lot of the mom and pop shops that are out there. And that's, again, one of the reasons why the transnational criminal organization type of designation can get at the major enterprises that are sustaining this and that have been operative for a long time and that are really a supply chain and a pipeline that are feeding a conflict for a very long time. And I will refer you back to the gold trafficking network that I spent 9 years documenting. It took that long to collect all the hard evidence in order for the Swiss prosecutors in the UK and Jersey Channel Island prosecutors to actually begin to open up criminal investigations to target them. But it's often perhaps useful to target the priority targets and to go after the very big enterprises that are right under our noses that are operating in some of these areas.
We have time for one last quick question. No, I'm getting the, okay. I'm sorry we've run out of time already for questions, but I hope these discussions can continue and will continue after the program's over. And I want everybody to please join me in thanking our excellent panelists. It's been a fascinating discussion.